I feel honored to chair this session with such distinguished speakers and with such serious audience. The topic of this first panel is opening a new strategic debate between transatlantic and Eurasian agendas. I think we are in the right time and also in the right place to start this debate. Since Ukrainian crisis started, we have been reading articles with titles such as New Cold War, Cold War II. Actually, Pope Francis, who was last week in my country, spoke also even for the World War III. Have we really entered in a new Cold War? If yes, who are the sides of such confrontation? Cold War was a war between two blocs. It was defined by ideological competition, a communist system versus a capitalist system. Both sides wanted to shape the world based on its ideology. Can we define clearly two blocs today, or we simply have two different competing agendas? Cold War was based also in what was supposed to be a military balance. Do we have such a balance today? Cold War also was based on the almost total lack of economical links and relations between the two blocs. Today, economical links are huge and cannot be ignored by neither side. Anyway, we talk today for European Union and Eurasian Union, for Transatlantic agenda and for the Eurasian agenda. We are aware for the differences, for major strategic differences, but there is also another question. Have they anything in common? Is there some common ground? Are some shared concerns and interests and some common and similar security threats? To discuss these issues and some other issues, we have a panel of distinguished speakers. Let me introduce them. Briefly, you have their CVs in bios in the program. I will briefly just introduce. We have Karen Donfried, the president of German Marshall Fund, coming from Washington, D.C. here. Karen, welcome. We have François Heisbourg, who is not for the first time in the forum, special advisor, Foundation for Strategic Research in Paris. Welcome, François. We have Adam Rotfeld from Polish Institute of International Affairs, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland. Welcome, Minister. We have Vladimir Baranovsky, an academic from Russian Academy of Sciences, Director of the Center for Situation Analysis. Welcome, Mr. Baranovsky. And here on my right, Shada Islam, the Director of Policy at Friends of Europe. Welcome, Shada. So, without losing time, I will start first with Karen Donfried. And my question is for you that yesterday we hear that Transatlantic Trends report, which was presented yesterday afternoon, and we saw that there are very interesting findings. What is your opinion? Do people in different parts of the world, different countries, feel that they are living in a Cold War based on transatlantic findings? Do people in the US think that they are living in a new Cold War? And your personal opinion, what do you think? Have we entered in a new Cold War? So.
Great. Well, thank you so much. My short answer is no, I don't think we're in a new Cold War. But before I fill that in, I just want to say it's wonderful to be back in Belgrade. And GMF is one of the partners in bringing about this conference, but being a partner is a whole lot easier than being an organizer. Because GMF also organizes conferences, so I do want to give a shout out to our three organizers, and this is a fabulous an agenda that you all have put together. So the Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence, the European Movement in Serbia, and the Belgrade Center for Security Policy. Thank you so much for bringing us all together, and kudos on a very impressive schedule. So is there a new Cold War? Maybe let me just start from my personal opinion, and then I don't want to speak for too long, but the reason I would say no, it's not a new Cold War, is because the world has changed over the past 25 years. Let's just think of the anniversaries we're celebrating this year. Poland celebrating 25th anniversary of its first free and fair election. In November, we'll celebrate the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And Russia has changed in these ensuing 25 years as well. And I think Russians like to travel, Russians like Western products, and I think that we have grown and changed in ways that are important. That said, I do think we, certainly Americans and Europeans, are facing the greatest challenge we have faced in the post-Cold War period. Why do I say that? Because our shared transatlantic policy has been pursuing a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace. That's the moniker we've used to describe this policy. And I think certainly in Washington, there was a belief that the premise of that policy remained true. The premise was that Russia had made a strategic decision that cooperating with the US and Europe was more in Russia's interest than engaging in open conflict. And what the illegal annexation of Crimea has made clear is that that assumption is no longer true. And that has serious implications for this post-Cold War policy that we've pursued. And it relates to the fact that when we think about transatlantic relations, this is not just an interest-based relationship. It's not just that the US and Europe think it's in our economic interests to cooperate or in our political interests, but that there's a community of values that undergirds that transatlantic relationship. And we've heard President Obama speak to this many times. We heard him speak to it just last week when he was at the UN General Assembly. And in the speech that he gave, he talked about the transatlantic relationship and US policy being based on a belief that we need to uphold international norms, and that it's not that might makes right. If you're a big country, it is not your right to reach over to your weaker neighbor and annex part of its territory. That's not acceptable. But that really it's right that makes might, and that it's values we believe in of democracy and free market economy and rule of law that ultimately prevail. And that's the challenge that we're dealing with today. And it's not saying there should be no relationship to Russia. The US has always been clear that Ukraine will have a relationship to its east and its west, but it's for 46 million Ukrainians to decide what those relationships should be. And so I think the challenge is, how do we have or encourage Russia to choose a different path than the one that it's been on? And certainly the hope is that the ceasefire currently in place will continue and provide us with that new path. So let me just stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much for your clear response. And now I move to François Heisbourg. François, I've been reading also a bit of your stuff these days. You've been very active in international media. My opinion is that it seems the world we are living is not that postmodern we thought or we imagined. We are now talking more and more for spheres of influence, balance of power, revenge of revisionist powers, strategic adjustments. I agree with what Karen said. It's not a new Cold War, but is this a return of geopolitics? If not a Cold War, is a return of geopolitics? And what kind of geopolitics?
Yeah, it's not the return of geopolitics for a very simple reason, and that is geopolitics have never actually gone away. the relationship between power and territory, which is what geopolitics are about, is a permanent feature of any international system. And I would venture so far as to put forward a counterfactual paradox. Let's imagine for a moment that we are in a pure Fukuyama world. The end of history has prevailed. We all share the same value system. We all operate within the same set of norms and relations. What would be left? Only geopolitics would actually be left. No, geopolitics have not gone away. But your companion question was, what kind of geopolitics? And this is where it becomes a bit more interesting. If one conceives geopolitics as being a zero-sum game, then there is a risk of that happening. Yes, there are, notably in Russia, people who do seem to think in pre-World War II terms. You see this, for example, in some of the writings of brilliant analysts like Sergei Karaganov, who makes the deliberate comparison between post-Cold War Russia and post-Versailles Germany, and saying, well, in the same way that post-Versailles Germany tore up the rule book of 1918, today Russia is tearing up the rule book, which purportedly was imposed on Russia after the end of the Cold War. It's a spurious comparison because, of course, nobody in the West ever annexed any Russian territory or imposed Versailles-style indemnities on Russia. But this is a mindset. However, even in the case of Russia, I would be careful not to say it's simply a return to pure zero-sum politics, because Russia, or Russia's leadership, purports to operate also on the basis of a value system. That value system is societally regressive, deeply conservative. The words which Prime Minister Vučić pronounced here about the gay pride could not have been pronounced in Moscow. It is politically counter-revolutionary. It reminds one of the ideology you had in Russia after 1815, the Holy Alliance. So this is not pure power politics. It's something somewhat more complex, because even in the case of those who purport to pursue power politics, values, implicit or explicit, are never far behind. They simply happen not to be our values. Now, you can also have a positive sum view of geopolitics. For example, I've been involved with this region not as a specialist, but as somebody with a cross-sectional view of international relations. I was part of the International Commission on the Balkans a few years ago. And when I asked myself the question, what kind of geopolitics would be good for Serbia? Which kind of geopolitics would be positive sum? And when I hear my friends here in Belgrade, this was the case yesterday evening at dinner with Serbian friends, and they were talking about the need to plug into China, to plug into the Gulf states, etc. And they're absolutely right. And at the same time, of course, this is not actually going to happen if Serbia is not a member of the European Union. Because what gives value to Serbia when you are in Dubai or in Beijing, it's the fact that Serbia can be the European pivot towards Asia. But Serbia is only going to be the pivot to Asia if it is part of the European Union. So the geopolitics of Serbia in that particular vision would be, well, yes, Serbia would be part of the European set of states, a full member of the European Union. These are not negative geopolitics. They're not zero-sum geopolitics, but they are geopolitics nonetheless. And what I would be the most afraid of, conversely, when it comes to geopolitical choices, would be one in which Serbia would be tempted to actually replay the game of the blocs of the Cold War. We're not returning to the Cold War. There are not two blocs in presence. And you cannot play the Tito game of the non-aligned movement. This is not going to work in the same way that a country like France cannot return to the policies of General de Gaulle, who was playing his own Tito-type policies during the 1960s. This is a very different world. If you try to replay the geopolitics of the Cold War in a non-aligned mode, then you're probably actually going to lose all value to just about everybody, except possibly in the case of Russia, of having some form of nuisance value operating in this region. So no, geopolitics remain with us, but they are not necessarily the geopolitics which, let's say, the Mearsheimer crowd would want us to believe to be the only possible geopolitics. Geopolitics are not zero-sum by definition.
Thank you, François. Thank you for these very interesting and provoking thoughts, I think, which I'm sure will create some debate. Now we move to Minister Rotfeld. In a letter you signed early this year together with some other colleagues, you mentioned that Ukraine must not become a new Berlin Wall. And in your letter, you also mentioned that there is a deficit of trust within Euro-Atlantic community. You talk also for the need to build a new, effective Euro-Atlantic security community. And the starting point is the dialogue, you say, the new dialogue among Euro-Atlantic states. How do you see this process? Can you elaborate a bit more?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting, and I would like to say that my task in the context of your question is somehow facilitated by my two predecessors, because I do agree both with Karen Donfried and François Heisbourg in the main message. I would like to say that most of us, we are oriented, I would say, by our schools, the tradition, way of thinking, just to find, I would say, some similarities in the past in search for the answers about the present situation and the future. And I would like to say that, in my view, the problem is that for 50 years after the Second World War, we were living in the world of stabilization based on the concept of status quo. The territorial status quo, it was considered as a kind of the cornerstone of the previous system. In fact, people did not notice that after the end of the Cold War, that type of stabilization is over. And in fact, we entered into the period of destabilization under the name of change. Change is not to be reconciled with stabilization. My intention is to say that not always stabilization means something positive and destabilization something negative, because the life and development, by the definition, is identified with a change. In other words, for us, a challenge for intellectuals, experts, etc., the challenge is to be innovative in a sense that situations are unconventional and we have to respond to them also in unconventional way. But people, by their, I would say, lack of, intellectual knowledge of a system, they try to repeat what they know from the history. For example, I do remember that Russian foreign minister since 2007 offered for the academic community in the Moscow Institute of International Affairs, IMEMO, lectures with the kind of the political philosophy that, and this lecture was repeated in next 5 years, and the message was always the same, that we have had very good experience in the 19th century. It was Metternich concept of the organization of Europe, in other words, the concert of great European powers. One can correct it a little bit, and instead of only European powers, one should suggest, for example, to re-establish Troika. It means the United States, European Union, and Russia. And my reaction reading, I would say, his lectures was that, in fact, he does not understand, or people who prepared for him this text, they do not understand that we are in the 21st century where are totally different preconditions. And I would like to say that another example is that many writers are speaking about unipolarity, multipolarity instead of bipolarity. And they do consider polarity as a kind of the permanent element in search for the organizing principle of the new system. I would like to say that polarity, it is something unique, which was the product of the situation after the Second World War. There is no multipolarity, neither unipolarity, for the reason that polarity is taken from the physics. And in physics, there are only two poles, plus and minus. You cannot offer, for example, the concept which could be constructed on one pole. Instead of one pole, they have had in mind hegemony. Instead of the multipolarity, they have had in mind sphere of interests or sphere of influences. And now I would like to say that we entered into the period of polycentric world, different centers of gravities. And Russians, in fact, are very much the hostages of, I speak about the Russians, I have in mind Russian leadership at the moment. They have had the concept of the 19th century as a kind of the ideal model to find the solution for the future in the past. Now, having said that, I would like to say that another group of people are considering that, in fact, we are in a very uncomfortable situation for the reason that institutions, security institutions, they do not correspond to the, in adequate way, to the new realities. And I would like to say that institutions, by the definition, should follow the problems, not other way around. In other words, the problem with institution is that once the problem is resolved, institution is still functioning, and it is a problem what to do with them. In other words, it is not, the gist of the problem is somewhere else. And my last point in this context is the following, that as rightly François just said, the problem is connected to great extent with the political philosophy of values, that we, and Karen said the same, that we in our part of the world, in transatlantic world, we constructed our security very close, and in fact, it was, I would say, the cornerstone for the security connected with the system of values, rule of law, liberties, free market. All that is, I would say, in my view, considered as a kind of the universal values. And here is my very fundamental problem, that unfortunately we do not have universal. They are defined as universal. They are proposed as universal. But however, everybody is saying that we have the same values, we do not have the same values. We have another set of values in our part of the world, and it is there are another set of values in different other regions, not only in Russia, but also in the Middle East, in Far East, in Latin America. In other words, the problem of values is at the moment very important because it is connected to a great extent with another issue, namely that all of us as experts or students, researchers of international relations, we have a tendency to think about international factors. But in fact, after the end of the Cold War, the problems are not between the states, but within the states, including Russia and Ukraine. The problems were generated in Russia, not between Russia and Ukraine, in Poland, in France, Germany, and the United States. In other words, this new element of internal domestic nature is, in my view, fundamental one in order to understand what is going on at the moment in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these thoughtful remarks, Mr. Rotfeld. Now I move to Mr. Baranovsky. On March 21st this year, just after the annexation of Crimea, you wrote that any crisis, even the most acute one, has a positive side as it makes the parties involved mobilize resources and search for a way out. My question is, what is the way out, according to your opinion? Yesterday, I read an interview of Minister Lavrov for Los Angeles Times, where he suggests that now we need what the Americans might call a reset. My question will be, what is a reset for Russians?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this forum and to agree with all those who said that it's a big event. I participate in this forum for the first time, and I'm really impressed by the scope and the character of discussion, and I'm sure that there is really a very significant future for the debate in this format. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this. Also, I appreciate the fact that all my colleagues in this panel have already addressed the issue of Russia in a very significant way. So what is left for me is only to make some comments to what was already said, and I basically agree with what was said by my colleagues. I think that on the level of analysis and the level of assessment of what is going on in the international system globally and in Europe, we all agree. And thank you for quoting something which I wrote recently when trying to analyze the most recent crisis. Indeed, I think that we have actually, at least we should try to make some lessons, to draw some lessons from the history, although it's a very ambivalent exercise. We all know that history is something which does not provide us with models of behavior. But however, when we are thinking about some historical equivalent, what I was thinking about, it was the situation of 1968. We all remember what happened in 1968 with respect of Czechoslovakia. There was something which was defined in my country as a fraternal assistance to Czechoslovakia by the Soviet Union and by four other countries, socialist countries as they were called at that time, in order to save the achievement of socialism. In fact, it was a pure intervention, no more than that. And at that time, in August '68, the general feeling, at least in my country, I was much younger and I was not very experienced, and I haven't had this knowledge of history as I have more now. But at that time, the feeling was that we are entering into a very long period of serious problems in relations with the West. So it was during the Cold War, but it was a situation when people thought that we are very close to the point where the Cold War could turn into something more dangerous. So it was in August '68. Less than 2 years ago, the Helsinki process started. It was the beginning of the process which brought about the Helsinki Decalogue, which brought about a breakthrough in the situation which existed in the international system in Europe at that time. So my point is that even when we have a very serious crisis, even when we have a very dramatic situation, we have to find some ways out, and the history shows that it's possible to find ways out. It's possible to draw some lines of thinkings and lines of behavior which could allow for some kind of solutions. And I come to the current crisis. Well, Ukraine, it's very upset. I'm very upset with what has happened, as I'm sure most of those who are present here. It's a tragic development. It's a development which undermines all what most people consider serious achievements of the post-Cold War developments. It's a kind of a breakup of the system which we were trying to create during more than 20 years after the post-Cold War. So it's on the one side. But on the other side, is it a new Cold War or not? I have serious temptation. It's probably many would have serious temptation to compare what is happening now with the traditional Cold War. But there are differences. It's true that there are very considerable differences, and they were mentioned in the previous comments. But I think that the comparison reveals a certain paradox. On the one hand, there is a serious risk that this so-called new Cold War could become deeper because stakes are higher, because the tools which are used or could be used, they could be more dangerous and could be considerably more risky. But on the other hand, major opponents in this kind of a bilateral confrontation which appeared on this field, major opponents do not seem too eager to engage in a serious confrontation. And what you have just mentioned about this idea of a reset of relations between Russia and the United States, I think that it's a kind of a reflection of this idea that we do not want to engage in a new Cold War. We are afraid that this could bring about very serious problems, much more serious than we have had now. And another interesting thing, another paradox when we are thinking about this analogy between the current development and the traditional old Cold War, it could be deeper, as I said, but on the other hand, it seems that it is developing faster than it used to be. Look, when this all started somewhere at the end of the last year, the beginning of this year, the Crimea episode and all other things, so the feeling was that everything is collapsing. Several months have passed. Well, a little bit more than half a year have passed. We have passed through several stages, including the stages of serious confrontation. Serious risk of confrontation. Take the episode with the shooting down of the civilian aircraft, which reminds us something about what happens in 1983 in the Soviet airspace. Yeah? So we have passed through several stages, but we are now, this is the feeling, this is the hope, if you wish, we are now at the stage of a détente. Détente, again, I use the comparison with the past, but it is the period which would push participants towards trying to find ways of getting out of this crisis. How this could be done, it's another issue. It's a big problem. It's a practical problem. The participants are trying to resolve this. It's very important that although there are a lot of problems and contradictions, and I know from my own country, inside the country, there is a very strong party of war, very strong party of those who would like to be very resolute with respect to this crisis and not to find compromises with whom they consider our serious ideological, geopolitical, and other types of opponents. But there is also the understanding that it is a way which could lead nowhere. There is understanding that we have to try to find this new compromise, in particular because not only because this leads to nowhere, but also because the agenda for the whole world, the agenda for all the participants, it's much broader than only those elements which push us towards a kind of a rivalry or confrontation or whatever. There is a common agenda. Sometimes this common agenda, it is removed. It seems to be removed somewhere out of the background. But there are real big problems in the international system, in the world development, problems which are related to the overall stability, to the overall prospects, and this is something where major countries and big international actors they have to join their efforts. I have no doubt about it. And one final point, it's something which you mentioned slightly in your question, but it's especially mentioned in the overall title of our panel. It's about the possibilities of putting together two agendas, Transatlantic Agenda and Eurasian Agenda. I think that it's a very interesting approach, perhaps very provocative approach. It's a little bit...
in the next round, I think.
In the next round, okay, then I stop at this moment and I will say this in the next round. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this open talk, and now I move to Shada Islam. You are an expert on Asian affairs, working for Friends of Europe. Our focus here is much too Eurocentric. We are talking Euro-Atlantic and Euro-Asian affairs. Of course, there are far away, very important great power games, actually, in Asia. My question is, what is the impact of what happens here in that part of the world? How China, India, and other Asian powers see what's happening in our part of the world. So.
Thank you very much, Remzi. It's also my first time here in Belgrade for the Security Forum, so I'd like to thank the three wonderful ladies for inviting me. Thank you very much indeed. Are we in a Cold War renaissance, let's say? I think the jury is still out. Certainly if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, looks like a duck, could be a duck. But I think the problem is that we need to be slightly more cognizant of the changes that we have talked about earlier. It's a very, very volatile world. It's a very dangerous world. It's a very disorderly world. And I think, as François has said, the issue of geopolitics power has not gone away, and it's definitely there, Remzi, in Asia, and I'll come back to that. I think we live in a very interconnected world and interdependent world, and this is going to make it easier, as Vladimir has said, to get beyond the current tensions and to look ahead. But it's going to be very difficult because our politicians in the East and the West, North and the South are stuck in a time warp. So I think the onus really is on think tanks and people like ourselves to try and get beyond the cliches and the stereotypes and to talk about what happens next. How do we prepare for the next era? Now, you asked me, Remzi, about what's happening in Asia, and really, Asia at the moment has other fish to fry than to get involved in this Eurasian transatlantic confrontation or disagreement, if you like. Very, very difficult fish to fry in Asia. Asian countries, the giants of Asia, if you like, China, Japan, India, and ASEAN, 600 million people live in ASEAN. We don't talk about ASEAN very often, but the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is a very powerful player in the region. These giants of Asia are so busy, first of all, connecting amongst themselves, and second of all, with their domestic issues. We've just seen China trying to tackle the demonstration, the protests in Hong Kong. They have to deal with 21st century challenges of climate change, still poverty and famine in many parts of Asia as well. And of course, the dreaded middle income trap, where the economies stagnate and you stop growing, basically. You stay at one level. So these are the key issues. And Russia recently has made enormous inroads into Asia. There has been a Russian pivot to Asia. We don't talk about it very often, but it's there, and it's very, very good, because the connections are getting stronger between Asia and Russia, and that, I think, is a very good thing. That's why, basically, Asian countries are not going to take sides. This will not be a global Cold War if we do head in that direction, and I have my doubts about it. What we're seeing at the moment is China not deciding yet whether it's going to be actually the let's say, the strongest power in Asia because it has to share, let's say, the power and the turf with Japan. Japan's not going to go away. Japan is going to stay there as well. And the new kid on the block, not new, very old civilization, is India. We've just seen Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the US, and that relationship is going to grow, become deeper. So I think Asia is going to stay very much involved with its own tractions, with its own problems, and is going to watch this carefully, very carefully, because as I said, we live in a very interdependent, interconnected world, but they're not going to become embroiled or entangled in this power struggle, if you like. I drew up a little bit of a hand graph, if you like. This shows the different, if you like, noodle bowl, not of FTAs and free trade agreements, but actually of relationships, alliances, and different flirtations, if you like, that are going on in Asia. And with the United States, with Europe, with Australia, and the time bombs, I would say, in Asia that we have to be quite wary of here is, of course, we talk about North Korea. That's a time bomb. We know that. It's also, but let's not forget Afghanistan, and let's not forget Pakistan. I mean, these two countries are also on the verge of becoming failed states. We have to call a spade a spade. And finally, my point would be, Remzi, that we here are, of course, centered on Europe, and we should be. This is going to be, Europe is a very important player in the world. I'm a firm believer in Europe, and that's why I work for Friends of Europe. But let's not forget the big threat, and this is something that we really haven't talked about here, and I'm surprised, but we should, is Islamic extremism. Not just the Islamic State, not just ISIS and ISIL, if you like, but the entire swathe of Muslim territory in the Middle East and parts of Central Asia, parts of South Asia, and growing into Southeast Asia of Islamic extremism, which is the ideology, Remzi, we have to be very careful about, being spread not by ISIS, not by Al-Qaeda, but by Wahhabism, which grows and is being nourished in Saudi Arabia and many of the other Gulf countries. So if there's going to be, if I may say, God forbid, a Cold War, we're going to find ourselves really fragmented into little bits and pieces of this and that. It's not going to be two blocks facing each other. We live in too much of an interdependent, interconnected world where we share so much space together that it's going to be terrible. So it behoves us to really make sure, as Vladimir has said, to move beyond this and to actually reset not just Russia-West relations, but reset global relations.
Thank you, Shada, for this very interesting approach, which I think complete the picture. Now, I will put a question for all the panelists, but we have not more than 2 minutes for each, because then we want to open a debate with the audience. So it was mentioned the common agenda, the common ground. Is it possible? Is the question. And how it can be built. Can it be built on values? I'm afraid it's difficult. The values in Moscow and Beijing are quite different with values in Paris or in DC. Can it be built on interest? Interest diverge and converge, yes and no. Can it be built on concerns, on threats, common concerns, threats like ISIS, like environmental pollution, concerns like Iran, like what's going on in Syria. So I would need, I mean, we are interested to know the opinion of panelists, how to build a common agenda, where to start. Yeah, Karen? And
common agenda between?
The two, let's say the two sides, the transatlantic agendas and the Eurasian agendas, let's say. Or, because we thought, we agreed that we don't have two blocks, but of course we have two different agendas in the world today.
Well, the starting point, certainly, I think, of US and EU policy was perhaps naive, but it was that these are not separate agendas. And certainly in the run-up to the European Union's Vilnius summit last November, the argument that the EU and the US had been making was that a Ukraine that has a closer relationship to the EU through an association agreement was in Russia's interest. That for Russia to have a neighbor that was more prosperous and more stable was a good thing for Russia. Now, obviously, President Putin did not find that a compelling argument, but this was not seen as an either-or argument at the time. We're now at a different place, but no one is arguing that there's a military solution to the crisis in Ukraine, that it can only be a political settlement, and that will have to be based on some understanding of shared interest. And it's striking to me when you think about the strategic outcomes of the policy President Putin has been pursuing. If his concern was a European Union that had a closer relationship to Ukraine, if we remember again back to last November, I mean, I recall concern in the EU about what heads of state were going to go to the Vilnius summit. There was not incredible enthusiasm in the EU for this summit where the association agreements were going to be signed. And in fact, many would argue that the association agreement was a mechanism to not have Ukraine become a member of the EU. The impact of the past several months has been a much deeper relationship between Ukraine and the EU. So that seems to me a strategic failure for President Putin. And then you think about President Putin's concern about a NATO that's more active in countries that border Russia. There was not enthusiasm in NATO for further enlargement, and yet we've just come off a NATO summit in South Wales where the reassurance mission to NATO member states in the Baltics, Poland, Romania, is much more significant than what it had been. And Ukraine's relationship is deeper. So I find this all strategically, I'm not quite following the logic of President Putin's policy. So I think we're trying to get to a place over Ukraine where President Putin realizes this strategy is not in Russia's interest, but in fact that there's a benefit to returning to a policy of cooperation. And I do think it will be based on interests. And what we've seen so far is that while there is this deep difference of view over Ukraine, and certainly it has to do with that illegal annexation of Crimea, but it also has to do with Russia's destabilizing actions in the eastern part of Ukraine, Russia is continuing to work with the US, with the EU on issues like Syria, like Iran. So there's cooperation happening on these other issues where Russia sees its interests as being served by that cooperation. So again, I think this is a very different dynamic than what we saw in the Cold War.
Thank you very much. François?
Yeah, there's a basic asymmetry involved here. Yes, there is a transatlantic world, and to a large extent a transatlantic agenda, which is of a global nature. But the Eurasian agenda is purely regional. It is about Russia's positioning vis-à-vis its neighborhood, vis-à-vis the possibility of reestablishing a new post-Catherinian empire. Think Catherine II or Potemkin, and don't think Lenin or Stalin. But don't think global either. So these are operating on a different plane, because if you're looking at the transatlantic world, the Schwerpunkt here of concerns are not in Ukraine. They are in China. China is the great emerging power. It is the new superpower. That doesn't mean that we're going to have an adversarial relationship or that we're going to have a new Cold War. But if you live in Washington, your bilateral relationship with Beijing is going to be the most important bilateral relationship that you have. This is not the case for President Putin. This is not like the Cold War, to come back to the discussion that we had earlier on. So the notion of finding a common interest between these two agendas is a bit complicated, simply because one is playing in a global field and the other is playing in a regional field. Secondly, it's always very difficult to define somebody else's interest. I think that President Putin, supported by most of Russia's elites and by a massive majority of the Russian population, considers that the current policies which are followed by Moscow are in Russia's interest. The opinion polls by Levada are serious opinion polls. They're deep. They're not superficial. It's all very easy to say that we're going to convince Putin that it is not in his interest for him to continue to do what he is doing. Well, maybe. And here I'll do a little bit of anecdote. In April 1940, the walls of Paris were covered with posters which showed a picture of the world with, in one color, the Allied countries, in another color, the Axis countries, and figures for steel production, coal production, number of population, etc. And the headline was, "Nous vaincrons parce que nous sommes les plus forts." We will win because we are the strongest. Now, this actually happened to be true. That is, 5 years later, Nazi Germany was dead because we were the strongest. The problem was that in the following 4 weeks, France was invaded. So the notion that we may eventually convince the Russians that we are right does not mean that we are going to convince them that we are right in the short run, and the short run is what is important for Ukraine. A last word on this. Historical analogies are used a lot these days. World War I anniversary, Karaganov and the comparison with post-Versailles Germany, neocon comparisons with Munich, all of that stuff. We've all heard it before, and comparisons with the Cold War. Well, my analogy, since everybody has one, my analogy would actually be to some extent with the wars of Yugoslav succession of the 1990s. What happened then? Well, first of all, it took 10 years between the first shot and the last shot. The first shot in Slovenia, the last shot in Macedonia. It took nearly exactly 10 years, day to day. So think 10 years when you're thinking about Ukraine and Russia. That would be my first piece of advice. Secondly, you have to, in order to be successful, you have to operate on the full spectrum of capabilities, from the military at the hardest end to economy, diplomacy at the other end, and everything in between. This is what eventually, after enormous difficulties, allowed the wars of Yugoslav succession to be brought to a close. This is not what the West has been doing vis-à-vis Russia, Ukraine. We have focused most of our efforts on simply one particular form of action, which is the sanctions, leaving most of the other instruments of power completely aside. President Putin, in this respect, is much more modern, much more comprehensive than we are in his approach. He uses every tool from information, operations, up to, of course, the invasion of territory and everything else in between. And lastly, you have to have clarity of purpose. In the Balkans, it took quite some time for the Western countries to define what their purpose actually was in the Balkans. In the case of Ukraine, Russia, we are still acting as if our ultimate purpose was the overthrow of Putin. That is what the sanctions look like from Moscow, because they are directed against Russia. They are not directed towards supporting Ukraine. It's not the same thing. Of course, they do not fulfill that purpose, but they are seen as having that purpose. That is not going to succeed. What is going to succeed is the support of what we consider to be our interests and our values, that is the preservation of the post-Cold War system, that is the freedom of choice of the countries of the former Soviet space, including, of course, Ukraine, if we don't fulfill these three conditions, that is thinking in time and thinking in terms of thinking full spectrum and being clear in purpose, then we will continue to be always 3 months, 6 months behind President Putin, and he will actually continue to prevail. And of course, in that situation, there will be no agreement. There may be an agreement if we apply some of the recipes which were applied during the 1990s.
Thank you. Minister?
I would like to continue what François just offered us, I would say, saying about the post-Catherine world, and he explained that it is Catherine the Great. I suppose my first reaction was that it is Catherine Ashton. But I would like to say that since few months, I tried to follow the program of the Russian television information programs. And there are some quotations repeated many times. One of them is that, that Russia, as people are repeating, following Alexander Gorchakov, the best foreign minister of Russia in the 19th century, that he said to Tsar that we have only 2 friends and allies. It is our army and fleet. And I would like to say that we are back to that, I would say, way of thinking with one additional element. Russia has, in fact, actually 3 allies: army, fleet, and the weakness of the Western democratic society. That means most of the European nations, they do prefer to keep Europe as a great Switzerland. Just prosperity, economic growth, all the freedoms, etc. It is, I would say, the highest priority. They do not think that there is a need to think in a very serious way about some threats which, in the perception of the people, they belong to the past. Now, I would like to say that thinking about transatlantic security and Eurasian security systems, they are composed, as all the security systems, by 3 elements: interests, common values, and power, the might of the nations in different areas. I have in mind, I would say, military, economic, technological. And I would like to say that, in fact, it seems to me that at present days, Russian leadership, and in fact, Russian leader, he does not believe that values, they do play a role. For him, interest and power are decisive factors. Having said that, I would like to say that there are a lot of different groups of experts, former politicians, who are thinking about a kind of the common security system. I have in mind, for example, Aspen Ministers Forum with Madeleine Albright as initiator, the Euro-Atlantic Security Initiative with Sam Nunn, Wolfgang Ischinger, Igor Ivanov. It is European Leadership Network with Desmond Brown and many others. It happens that I do participate in all these groups. And in fact, we are discussing quite often not in vacuum, but ignoring the reality. Because reality was for all of us unpredictable, in a sense that there are a lot of irrational elements in the behavior of a Russian leader. I would like to say that many people are telling me that, no, he is very rational. He is rational, but on the other hand, it is very emotional. It is not a great strategy, ground strategy. It is not because of the strength of Russia that Russia is stronger than the others. In opposite, Russia is, in my view, motivated by the weakness. Russia did not achieve what they have had, I would say, the concept, for example, in the recent 15 years was modernization of Russia. The increase of the national product in Russia last year was 1.3%. This year will be probably a recession lower than zero. And it is a kind of what Germans are saying, Flucht nach vorn, escape to the future, just to offer another agenda. Everybody is now speaking about new system with Russia. And in my view, what has to be done, it is a need to demonstrate that we are prepared to resist and to contest this type of thinking. We are prepared for that, and we are ready to cooperate with Russia. And in order, I would say, not to speak on behalf of Russians, I would like to say that since Vladimir is with us, that I have before me here a quotation of the study prepared by one of the best teams in Russia, if not the best one, how the security system of Russia should be organized. And the quotation is as follows: our objective interest today is to generate not so much a fear of Russia because it is strong and barely containable, but a respect towards it because it is strong and keen to pursue responsible and cooperative policies. Unfortunately, this concept presented more or less 4 years ago at the moment is in fact considered as not realistic. The choice was taken in totally different way. But those people who formulated this type of concept, they still, in my view, they have the future. The problem is, with them, it will be possible to construct a new joint and common agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Vladimir, brief, please.
I think just taking the last phrase of Professor Rotfeld, the question is whether these people would be able to survive those 10 years which are in front of us. This is a big problem. So I think that here we have touched upon a very important issue of time framework, a longer-term prospect and the short-term problems that we have now. In the longer term, I have no doubt that there is a very serious rationale for thinking about two agendas as agendas which should not be competitive. I think that this is a major point. Transatlantic agenda and Eurasian agenda, they are different. They probably have different orientations in terms of the character of its global scope. Here I agree with François with certain qualifications. But I think what is important here, it's to avoid the situation when these two agendas are competitive, which is the case, which has been the case very often. I will give you just two examples about those countries who are very close to me. The issue of Russia. In Russia, there has been, and there is a continuing debate about Russia belonging either to Europe or to the Eurasian entity, and this debate is inconclusive. Probably it is doomed to be inconclusive, but the fact that Russia remains somewhere in between has a very negative result. There is this perception about the competition of these two agendas, and I think it's very important to prevent the further aggravation of this competitive character of two agendas for my country, because if this continues, we are doomed to have a lot of problems similar to the Ukrainian crisis. But I think that something similar has happened with Ukraine. It was a competitive agenda promoted by many people in Ukraine, promoted by many people in my country, and promoted by many people in the West. It is the approach which is based on the formula either or. Either Ukraine belongs to Europe, or it remains under the influence, under the coverage of Russia. Either or. This is exactly the competitive agenda. And if we proceed on this assumption, then the result, logically, the result could be all kind of negative developments. And let's say the highest point of this negative development we have seen. It has continued right now. So the basic problem is to try to find a solution which would overcome this competitive character of the agenda and would be based on another formula, both and. Russia, which would belong both to the European pattern of thinking, pattern of political developments, and to extra-European, because if you look just on the map, we understand that Russia has broader perspectives, even geopolitical perspectives, than strictly European. And the same for Ukraine. Ukraine has a kind of a vocation of continuing and promoting its European perspective, but Russia is close. Russia is geopolitically close, economically close, historically close. There are a lot of affinities which cannot be ignored, and it's very important not to have a conflictual development of these two things. And in this sense, I think that promoting cooperative pattern of these two agenda is very important with respect to these two countries, but also in a broader sense. Values or interests, I think that I will shorten this. Interests are very important. Look, here I say that I agree basically with François, but listen, a Eurasian agenda, it's also about global things. The Chinese element there, I understand that in transatlantic agenda, the Chinese element is present in a more significant way. But the Chinese element in Eurasian agenda, it is something which is, let's say, it's not a hidden element. It's a long-term element, which is probably not promoted on the front, but which exists there. Or take the element of Central Asia, or let's say southern underbelly for both transatlantic and Eurasian world, Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iran and everything. So these are the objective fields where this two agenda could promote a kind of a cooperative approach. It's difficult to say to make it. There are a lot of shorter-term problems of this 10 years framework problems, and sometimes they could undermine this longer-term perspective. But I think it's really very important to try to have a longer-term vision. And my last phrase, in order to minimize these shorter-term problems, undermining the longer-term perspective, I think it's very important when thinking about Ukraine just to consider what could be the next possible crisis because of the development in Ukraine and around Ukraine. And my personal forecast is the following. I think that Russia's miscalculation is that trying to undermine the prospects which Russia considers negative from the point of view of Russia's broader interests, like NATO or so basic problem is that Russia feels marginalized, that Russia feels that the major lines of European development are taking place without Russia's considerable participation, without Russia's considerable involvement. So in this respect, NATO, in spite of all the treaties and agreements which we have had, is still perceived as a kind of a competitive actor. So Russia wanted to minimize the role of NATO. Instead, after this Ukrainian crisis, the result will be that NATO will be moved closer to Russian borders, closer to Ukraine, closer to other countries which could have continued as, let's say, kind of neutral entity, and this is going to be the most serious problem and the next phase, in particular the issue of character of relations of future Ukraine with NATO. Nowadays it seems a very remote agenda, but it could become a serious problem just in a few years.
Shada?
Yes. Yes, that's fine. 3 quick points, but I think, Vladimir, you're right. Russia has given a new life to NATO, has given additional relevance to NATO, which it was losing, let's be quite frank about that. 3 quick points. First of all, when we sit in Europe, it's very easy to get entangled in this debate about values and interests. In the rest of the world, whether it's Latin America, Russia, or Asia, it's about pragmatism. It's about doing business. It's about growth and jobs. It's about getting further, faster. So those countries are pragmatic, and they're not bothered about whether it's values or interests. And you can see that in their foreign policies, their trade policies, their business dealings across the board. Secondly, military power may be important, but in today's world, it's thoughts, ideas, smart power, soft power, call it what you will. That's what buys friends. That's what gets friends and people who believe in your kind of lifestyle, if you like. I remember François made a point in Paris a couple of weeks ago where he said, you know, they, meaning the rest of the world, may not like us, but they do like our values. And I think that's absolutely spot on. The rest of the world, whether you're in China, whether you're in Hong Kong, India, universal values or European values do stand out. And that is our power, our most important asset when we're dealing with the rest of the world. Now, the common agenda, Remzi, I mentioned it earlier, I think the 21st century challenges that we all face across the globe are the same, and they require partnerships and alliances, coalitions to tackle them. The next Sustainable Development Goals, fighting poverty, the MDGs that are still patchy in their implementation, climate change, the fight for resources, the struggle for resources, if you like. Urbanization across the board. We're all seeing the growth of megacities, and we know how dangerous they can be if they're not dealt with and managed in a proper manner. And my last point is what I said initially as well. What brings us together, whether we're in the west or the east, the north and the south, is really the rise of Islamic extremism, this radical, orthodox, hijacked form of Islam that is gathering pace across the world. And there I say, Europe has a role to play. We are hosts to about 20 to 25, maybe even 30 million Muslims. If you include the Balkans, it'll be probably 40 million Muslims. There is an authentic, rigorous thought going on within Europe about a version of Islam which is European, which meets our values. We should nurture it. And there, I think, countries like we are here, the Balkans, have a big role to play. We should not let this wonderful religion be hijacked and absolutely taken away by extremist ideologies that are being nourished and exported from certain countries in the Middle East, and I've named them before. And I think that is something that draws us together and gives us a common challenge to work at together.
Thank you. Now we have some time for questions and some discussion. Without losing any minute, please, who would like to have questions to the panel, or very brief, very short comments? Yes, Luan.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrej Matišek. Andrej Matišek, Daily Pravda, Slovakia. Just a short question. I know it is not easy to answer, but maybe you will say yes or no. I just covered NATO summit and in Wales, and many Central and Eastern European diplomats told me that they were quite surprised that the summit was less about Ukraine and more about Middle East, ISIS, and so on. Maybe all panelists, if I may ask them to say, what do you think is the bigger threat to international order, to Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine crisis, or rise of Islamic extremism as we see it in Iraq, in Syria? I know we can discuss it for hours, but maybe just give me your opinion, just that or this. Thank you.
Thank you. More questions? Mm-hmm. Yes, there. Okay, then.
Thank you. My name is Wallace from the University of Nairobi in Kenya. Okay, as the world becomes more and more interconnected, more and more interdependent, more and more interrelated and more intertwined. Is there a conflict between the personal, or rather nationalistic interests, and the interests that we all share by virtue of being human beings living in the same planet? If yes, how should this conflict be reconciled? Thank you.
Thank you. Over there, please.
Thank you. I'm Dennis Keefe. I'm the British ambassador in Belgrade, but I've spent the last 8 years living in Russia and Georgia. I was struck by two things in that fascinating discussion of comparisons with the Cold War. One was a point made explicitly in different ways, that this isn't like the Cold War because it's not the world-defining contest that was. There are many other big issues shaping the world for us today. But my question was about something that I didn't hear. As I remember the Cold War, a lot of it was handled by the creation of institutions, by the creation of international legal frameworks. This time round, whatever it is that's happening, we seem to be experiencing decay of institutions, and certainly not proposals for new ones. Is that just because we're at the beginning of the new phase, or is that also something that has changed fundamentally? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, here. Dusan?
Thank you. Dusan Reljic from the German Institute for International Affairs and Security in Berlin. My question goes to Mr. Baranovsky. Is Russia seeing the EU also as a threat to its interest in Ukraine, or is it limited only to NATO expansion? Thanks.
Thank you, Dusan. Yes, over there.
Stephen Blockmans, Centre for European Policy Studies in Brussels. We've heard a lot about the common agenda between the EU and Russia also, and I would like to prod the panelists a little further on defining which key interests and in which areas that common agenda could be defined.
Thank you. So I don't see more hands, and we don't have time, actually. Who would like to start? François?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. First, the question which was posed about global issues, interdependence, and so on. We are in the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the First World War, and although, as we all know, all analogies are imperfect, there's one very clear lesson from both the run-up to the First World War and to what has been going on between Russia and Ukraine over the last 6 months, and that is that economic interdependence and other forms of interdependence are definitely not something which prevents war between powers. Does it make economic sense for Russia and Ukraine to be fighting? I think the answer is fairly obviously no. And of course, it made no economic sense whatsoever to have a world war in August 1914. So I'm afraid my answer to that question is going to be rather negative. Secondly, ISIS, Islamic threat, and so on. In France, apart from the horrible murders provoked by Mohamed Merah 2 years ago, we did not have a single person killed by international terrorism on our territory since 1996, whereas in the previous 15 years, we had about 400 people who were killed. And yet people are much more worried today. Well, terrorism is designed to instill terror. The horror of certain forms of killing are designed to fulfill that aim, and the mass media and the social networks, in that sense, play their role in propagating that particular message of terror. Does this make these kinds of problems particularly important? Well, on a day-to-day basis for politicians who have to deal with the public fear, the answer is yes. If you're thinking 10 or 20 years, the answer is probably not terribly much. When we overthrew the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, that was fine, but we decided it was a good idea to hang on for another 12 years. That was not so fine. And during those 12 years, the rest of the world changed, except that the United States and Western Europe spent actually most of their military effort in dealing with a strategically third-rate part of the world called the Hindu Kush, which school children in 20 or 30 years will simply not understand why we were spending 13 years in that fly-bitten part of the world. And we're now running the same risk with ISIS. I am very happy when we bomb terrorists. I mean, I have no problem of principle on that one. I'm delighted. But I am not sure that the investment in the long run is going to be very helpful. I do see it very much as a distraction. What would not be a distraction would be the succession crises which may open up in places like Saudi Arabia and Algeria. That may be a big strategic problem from the Middle East. But ISIS, it's more like the Boxer Rebellion or dealing with the anarchists who killed so many presidents, kings, and queens 120 years ago in Europe. We were all in agreement. In Prussia, France, Spain, Italy, and so on, the United States, all lost heads of state and government because of the anarchists, and we were all cooperating to deal with them, and we eventually did. It didn't prevent us from doing World War I. World War I was a bit more important than the anarchist threat. And lastly, the decay of institutions. This is an enormously important point in that, here again, if China is in the ascendant, if China is going to become the new superpower, and although there is no basic interest, I think, for anybody to have a Cold War with China, I think there is a sort of basic interest, certainly from the European standpoint, that there should be strong international institutions to serve as a corset for whatever temptations great powers may have, and notably the new rising powers, and especially China. And yet, what are we doing? The United States of America is bombing in Syria. Now, here again, I don't have a problem with bombing terrorists in Syria or anywhere else. I'm very glad that they're bombed. But the problem is that we are firmly outside, at least to my reckoning, of the global system, of the UN system. Is it in our interest to establish the practice that as long as you have told in advance to a head of state like Bashar al-Assad or maybe tomorrow Poroshenko, that, oh, by the way, we may need to bomb awful people who are on your territory, so please don't shoot at our aircraft. Now, if this is the new international law, I suspect that we, the Europeans, are going to, and the Americans, at the end of the day, are going to suffer more from that form of decay of international institutions than whatever short-term gain we may be securing by entering into these kinds of practices. And the Russians, who are very serious about the Security Council, have made the point already very clearly and very strongly in the case of the bombing in Syria. Oh, they're not shouting and screaming. They're simply saying those who are unilaterally engaging in military action in Syria will have to face the consequences in terms of international law and practice. So we have to be very careful in not having tunnel vision, dealing with the emergency of the day, ISIS, which is the emergency of the day, at any price. And then all of a sudden, 6 months or 1 year later, we will be surprised that in an anarchic, chaotic Ukraine, which will have imploded economically and politically, maybe it's a possible scenario, that the Russians would be bombing this or that group of Ukrainian quote-unquote Nazis, beautiful historical analogy which we get from the Russian news agencies, and the Russians will say, well, we're only doing what you did in Syria. This is very dangerous, and we should be thinking here again much more broad spectrum than we have been, than we in the West have tended to do over the last 15 years.
I mean, maybe just to
Brief,
follow up
please.
on, absolutely, I'm just going to make 2 points, and it's really connecting the first and the third questions. I mean, from where I sit, I think the biggest challenge that is facing us is not Ukraine and it's not the Islamic State. It's the change in distribution of power in the world. So we can talk about whether that is relative decline of the West, which is the way some people talk about it, or you can talk about it as rise of the rest, or you can talk about a diffusion of power. Whatever terminology you want to use, that is the big challenge. And this relates to the Obama administration's talking about a pivot to Asia, and then changing that terminology to a rebalancing to Asia because they wanted to make clear they weren't pivoting away from anyone. Europe should embrace a pivot or a rebalance to Asia because this is about the future. And the idea was never that the US was pivoting away from Europe. We should be pivoting together. And it relates to the point about institutions, and we've not done nothing, but we need to do more. I mean, certainly the G20 was one piece of that. How do you engage these emerging powers into a global system? And let's be honest, it's a global system that the US and its European allies set up together after World War II. So you either reinvigorate those institutions, turning the G7, G8 into a G20, or thinking about IMF reform, or thinking about the role you want the UN to play, or there could potentially be new institutions created by those rising powers. And clearly there's a lot more that we need to do on that front. But I think that, the second point is we've got to be doing this together. And we also, no one has mentioned the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And I think it's worth spending a moment on that because yes, geopolitics have never gone away, but geoeconomics matter as well. And that's come up on this panel. Why does TTIP matter in that global context if we're talking about a diffusion of power? Because today the US and Europe make up the preponderance of the global economy. So we do have a special place in that global economy. And if we believe that in future all of our interests are served by having a rules-based system, then taking advantage of this moment for the US and Europe to agree on a TTIP sets a frame and sets a stage for emerging powers then to accede to that rules-based system. So I think when we define what the challenges are, we do need to be thinking about the mechanisms that bound and help us frame managing that challenge. Thank you.
Shada,
I would like to say a few words in the context of
Minister, because we are
Ukraine, which was, I would say, the question of Ukraine was raised. And it seems to me that for obvious reason, for Ukrainians, it is the priority of priorities. It is not only problem number one, but it is the problem. And to some extent, it is also that type of perspective for Poland, for the Baltic states. The closer to the conflict, the more important, I would say, the question how to resolve this problem is. In France or Spain, they have totally different perspective, not saying about the United States or China. And now I would like to say that all the nations are motivated in defining their foreign and security policy by their own national interest. In this context, I would like to say that we, for many reasons, we are not discussing what happened in Ukraine, why it happened, and to what extent it is the responsibility of the Ukrainian president's government since 23 years, I would say, since Kravchuk, Kuchma, Yushchenko, Yanukovych, all of them contributed, I would say, to that situation. Instead of reforming the state, they created a kind of the semi-state which was very much oriented to the interests of oligarchs. And this should be the subject of very serious discussion within Ukraine. It is not the best time now to discuss what I said. But what, in my view, should be taken under consideration thinking about the future in the context of the transatlantic, Transasian, or global system. In my view, the systems, they emerge, the new system, they emerge not as the result of the discussion like our Belgrade Security Forum, or I would say many other this type of meetings and discussions among the researchers, scholars, and former politicians. The new systems emerged as a response to the real new common threat. And for example, in the context of ISIS, I would say that this Islamic State, it is by many seen as a new common threat. It is a threat both for the Western democratic community and for Russia. However, it is not seen at the moment and not presented in that way in Russia. But it seems to me that evolution of the Russian approach is connected with the fact that time is ripe now to find something in common between the West and Russia. And I would like to say that sooner or later, it will be a need to elaborate not necessarily the new institutions, but to introduce some elements of the fundamental reform in the existing institutions. I have in mind, for example, we do not discuss here the United Nations, but what is going on, that this institution is more and more marginalized. And it is marginalized for the reason that institutions are established in certain historical moment, and if they are not adapted to the new evolution, they are simply irrelevant. And in my view, United Nations is relevant in many other aspects, but definitely Security Council and the composition of the group of permanent members of Security Council should be taken as one of very serious problems. Otherwise, United Nations system will be totally irrelevant. Thank you very much.
Okay, Vladimir or Shada?
Yeah, I can come in. We live in a world of multiple threats, so I don't like the either-or question. But I do want to come back to what François has said. I think you're taking, François, a rather partial view of the Islamic State and the threat it poses. Of course, it's first of all to the region, and I can understand that when we're in Europe, we don't necessarily take on board the threat and the challenges facing the Muslim world. It's not just about terrorism. And I have a problem with bombing terrorists if you don't have a plan for the day after. And I think once again, as in the case of Afghanistan, Iraq, we're going in eyes wide shut. We don't know what we're going to do next step. We can wait for the Saudi succession, but there are about 80 of them waiting to take the throne and then die, so it's not going to be tomorrow. Secondly, about lack of leadership, I think it's very important, decaying institutions, to get the voices of China, India, on board in global institutions. We're not doing it, and you see what happens. We get the BRICS Bank, and increasingly countries are lining up to join the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's not a bad thing, but the world is moving on. And if America and Europe cling to the status quo, it's going to make it even more compelling for countries, not the rest of the world, but emerging strong countries, to do their own thing. And why not? Karen talked about the changes in the distribution of power and how Europe has to join America's pivot. Well, Karen, Europe has its own pivot. Europe has a very strong policy on Asia, which in the last 3 years has been elaborated with great finesse and detail by the External Action Service. I'm a big critic of EU foreign policy, and I've been a critic on Asia, but I have to say hats off. For the last 3 years, there's been a really strong focus, energy put into developing an Asia policy for Europe. And it's a comprehensive policy. It's not just about a military pivot to Asia. It's not just about shoring up alliances and reassuring Japan and the Philippines. It's really about engaging in the development of Asia. And I'd like to say just finally, local is global and global is local. I mean, we've seen this with the Ebola crisis now in West Africa, how it's impacting on all of Africa. I was in Rwanda just a week ago, and Rwanda is far, far away from Western Africa, but the shadow of Ebola hangs over the entire African continent, impacting on tourism, on the economics of Africa, and investments coming in. So I think the first thing I will say is we really live, it's not just words, we really do live in an interconnected world. And what America does in Iraq and Afghanistan has vast repercussions across the region. National boundaries don't count anymore. Let's be very frank.
Thank you, Shada.
Because of the time limits, very short comments on 2 points. First, about institutions. Yes, Russia is very strongly attached to the institutional approach. In parentheses, it's only attached, well, first of all, to those patterns which it considers to operate in its own interest. But it's natural, it's a rule of the game. But what is worrisome to me is the fact that during this recent times, we have seen a more ambivalent attitude of Russia towards some of these elements. And I think that this is the result of the ambivalence which have been demonstrated by the United States and by some of the Western countries. And if you take this traditional approach of Russia, at least until the year 2008, it was about the role of Security Council, it's about the fact that it's impossible to use military force across the borders without the sanctions of the Security Council and so forth. It has become to be a little bit different after the year 2000 yet. In the case of Ukraine, in the case of Crimea, Russia was very actively used the reference to the international law, but let me put it in a mild way. This was not as convincing as it used to be. As it used to be in the past, when there was a very consistent approach that Security Council has to play a key role in such kind of situation. And so I'm a little bit worried that the situation is changing even on the level of Russia's approach. And the second point was your question about the attitude of Russia towards NATO and the European Union. So to put it in a simplistic way, which of these two is more damageable from the point of view of Russia? So the answer is nowadays, unfortunately, both are considered as damageable in terms of putting Russia a little bit to the margin of the European development. It used to be different in the past. When we come back to the 90s, when there was the first round of discussions about a post-Cold War enlargement of NATO, one of the popular arguments in Russia was the following: listen, we are concerned about NATO because NATO is the result of the Cold War. We are not concerned about the European Union. It's not about security. It does not touch upon very sensitive aspects of Russia's existence. This was in the 90s. There were some people, including me at that time, who were saying, listen, why we are so much focused upon NATO? NATO is something which is dealing with those elements which are important, but which concerns only security. We had the Russia-NATO Founding Act, which actually addressed these aspects of security for the benefits of both sides. Whereas the enlargement, eventual enlargement of the European Union, it's more serious. It's more serious because it's about society in general. It's about how the economy is operating. It's about the society, about the civil rights, about the institutions, about the judicial system, and so on and so forth. And I'm afraid that those people who were saying that European Union is a most serious entity, more fundamental, more let's say, all-embracing pattern than NATO, they have turned right. And now we see in the case of Ukraine, the fact that Ukraine was trying to move away from Russia in the direction of the European Union, this was perceived as something very damageable from the point of view of Russia's ability to exercise influence over this part of the European space.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. I would like to thank the panelists for their great contribution. I would like to apologize to organizers that we abused some 10 minutes with the time, but they excused us. We'll close the panel here. We'll have a break half an hour, and the next panel starts at 12. Please be here 5 minutes before, because we have to start at 12 sharp. Thank you all.